Thank you, Astro, for inviting me again, and to Peter for having me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be here. Today I want to talk about Aristotle, and the reason why I'm doing so is that I have a view on what it means for an intentional state or attitude to be shared, and given the criticism that is being voiced in our current community, among others by Katja Krone, I'm trying to get help with the classics. So if I'm right, it should be the case that, well, at least, I mean, if Aristotle sees it, if it's in Aristotle, it's got to be right. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, it's not about zoology or physics, it's about philosophy, and if it's in Aristotle, it's probably right. And I think what I'm trying to say is sort of in Aristotle, and I want to show you how. So the topic is well-being, and that plays an important role in Aristotle, and let's just accept this. So I'm not going to discuss this. This is just Aristotle's basic view of well-being, and he says well-being is primarily a form of activity. So it's a property of what we do. Of course, there are also external goods. You know, if you're totally sick, you cannot be well. But primarily well-being is in how you act, and it's the feature and virtue of which how you act is well-being, is virtue. So well-being is virtuous action over a lifetime. It's not just, if you're doing something good, virtuous, then you're well. It has a temporal structure, and it stretches across, at least across your life, even though Aristotle says that even after your life, things can happen that affect your well-being. So let's just accept this, and here is the question I want to ask. I'm obsessed with this distinction between distributions and collections. And you could read Aristotle's claim in two ways. The distributive reading is well-being is what each of us rationally wants or should want in his or her own life, and it is in each one's own virtuous action over his or her own lifetime. If that's the reading, the subject of well-being, the person whose well-being it is singular. The other reading is collective. In this reading, there is something like being well together, and it is what we jointly want in our shared life, and it consists in our joint virtuous activity over the time of our living together. And if that's a reading we could take, the subject of well-being would be plural. Of course, the collective view doesn't exclude a distributive view, it is inclusive, whereas the distributive view excludes a collective view. So nobody wants to claim that we're just living together. Of course, we have our private lives. But the claim is that there is such a thing as living together, and if it is virtuous, it is our joint well-being. So what's the difference? Distributive well-being is ours in virtue of your and my well-being, whereas collective well-being is yours and mine in virtue of its being ours. So the collectivity is sort of basic for how it pertains to each of us in the collective case, whereas it is the other way around in the distributive case. In distributive well-being, your well-being and my well-being may be qualitatively identical or the same, and they may be interrelated in many ways, but they are not one. In collective well-being, there is one well-being with many participants. And insofar as this is true, insofar as it is one, let's call it token well-being, your well-being is my well-being in the collective case, because it's the same. So here is the claim I want to defend. There is collective well-being, and it is irreducible to a distribution of well-being. And given the fact that our lives are partly shared, we need a collective conception of well-being to complement the distributive conception. So I do not want to deny that parts of our lives are separate, are private, do not include others. But there are parts of our lives which we share. And insofar as we share it, there is one life which we're living together. And the literature generally does not allow for a collective reading, where it is considered at all, it is claimed to be conceptually incoherent or delusional. And here is a reference, and it is authoritative because it comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's by Roger Crisp, and his entry on well-being. And, you know, he's an Aristotle scholar. And he says this, and it's basically a ban on collective conceptions of well-being. This is what he says. On Aristotle's view, it might be tempting to say that your well-being is part of mine, in which case the distinction between what is good for me and what is good for others has broken down. But this temptation, of course, as with any temptation, it should be resisted. Your well-being concerns how well your life goes for you. And we can allow that my well-being depends on yours without introducing the confusing notion that my well-being is constituted by yours. There are signs in Aristotelian thought of an expansion of the subject or owner of well-being. A friend is another self, so that what benefits my friend benefits me. But this should be taken either as a metaphorical expression of the dependence claim, or as an identity claim which does not threaten the notion of well-being, namely qualitative identity rather than numerical identity. It's just that our well-beings are sort of, you know, very similar. They amount to the same. We like the same stuff and we share it, and sort of this interdependence increases our, I don't know, well-being, but there are two lives and they are very similar. And they sort of, you know, they resonate with each other in all sorts of ways, but it's two lives. So this is Roger Crisp, and keep it in mind, and this is what I want to refute in what I'm going to present. And I have a great many slides, and it is a bit of a confused thing, so I just can warn you. But this is the claim I want to attack, and it is by Roger Crisp. It's in the Stanford Encyclopedia. It has some weight. So let me first try to reconstruct Roger Crisp's view. What could be the reason to be so harsh against collective notions of well-being? Why? And then I want to point out what might be missing in such a conception. What is it that we miss? And then I want to go into Aristotle and show that he not only has a view of collective well-being, but that it is a view that involves plural pre-reflective self-awareness. It's really that notion which I try to reconstruct without Aristotle that I'm finding in Aristotle, and it is the origin of the concept of common sense, sensus communis. In Aristotle, it's syn aesthesis, and I'm really quite excited. I'm not 100% sure it's going to fly, and I'm not really engaged in Aristotle scholarship, but I sense that there is something big to get here. So why does Roger Crisp, what's the reason for this harsh statement against collective notions of well-being? So here is the line of thought that leads us to singularism. So well-being is a form of activity. And each individual's behavior, if it is action, instantiates his or her own activity, right? So whenever somebody's behavior is an action, it is his or her action, right? That's plausible. So each individual is the subject of his or her own well-being, because he or she is performing her own action, and well-being is a form of activity. It's his or her own well-being. So no individual is the subject of another's well-being. Because I cannot engage in your activity, but at best make it the case that you act, which is my activity. Right? So if I get you going, I'm doing something, namely the getting you going. Your going is your activity, but my getting you going is my activity. So it cannot be the case that my well-being is yours, right? This is as sound as anything in philosophy, right? Obvious. So, and you know, singularism is not autism. So here is what Aristotle says. It seems that it is his or her own good that each one hekastos philein likes or loves. So each one loves his own good, it seems, Aristotle says here. And it is mostly the autotagata, the own good, that each of us wants mostly, in the second quote, malista. So, but Aristotle is clear, very clear in the Nicomachean Ethics that well-being implies virtues such as justice and generosity. It's not just that I'm just in it for my own basket of goods. It's not mutually disinterested rationality in, say, Rawls' sense. Of course, we want stuff for others, and generosity is an important part of virtue. And it's not that each agent pursues his or her own well-being in a sense that it's just his or her own self-interest that is being served by pursuit of well-being, or by the living of a virtuous life. That's obvious in Aristotle. So one's own well-being serves others. The ontological subject of well-being is to distinguish from the beneficiaries of well-being. So my well-being sort of, you know, you're going to profit from it, because if I'm living a virtuous life, I'm going to be generous and just, and that's going to serve you. But it is my well-being, not yours. So, and singular well-being is interconnected with others in many ways. One's own well-being may imply being with others. Aristotle is quite clear on that. And other people's well-being may be a precondition of one's own. I'm not quite sure whether this is in Aristotle, but I can sort of hear him saying that, yeah, well, if your parents are miserable, they're not going to make you a virtuous person. They cannot serve as the sort of exemplar that's going to lead you in a virtuous life. You need sort of these role models that instantiate virtuous action for yourself to become virtuous. That sounds very Aristotelian, right? So he could have said it. I don't know, maybe he did. And this is an important point, singular well-being may be general, universal in form. So insofar as well-being is constituted by justice, so justice seeks a good, but it is different from, say, lust, in that the good that's thought in lust is a good for me. So lust, you know, is a good, but it has sort of a singular focus. It is what it is just for me. And this is different in the good that's thought in virtues such as justice, because just is not just for me. It is in its nature general in form. It's just for everybody. So they are general formal objects of intention in virtuous action. So that's all fine, and Crisp suggests that this is all there is to, you know, the social dimension of well-being. It's this sort of interconnectedness, interrelations that makes our well-being sort of social. And I want to argue that there's something missing. You know, we're still not getting the decisive point about our living together. So here is my claim. Insofar as you are pursuing only your own well-being and I am pursuing only mine, we're living alongside each other rather than living together, no matter how logically general, mutually dependent and mutually beneficial our individual well-beings are. It's still parallel individual lives that might be interconnected in all sorts of ways, but it is not a shared life. It's not living together, it's living alongside each other in a tightly interconnected way. So the problem with singularism is not egocentrism, autism, or particularism, that I'm in only for what's in it for me, but it is the problem is that we're just not getting at the togetherness of the activity of living. So Crisp's advice to reduce the collectivity claim to dependence and similarity does not seem to help here. The problem with singularism is that there is, in a singularist conception, like in Crisp's, no shared life, and the Aristotelian term is sytzen, living together. A brief reflection on the concept of sharing, and this is not exhaustive, but here are two important distinctions. We can understand sharing in terms of a state or in terms of an activity. And in terms of state, I propose to distinguish type sharing, where sharedness is a general state, like when we share the preference for red wine, in terms of each of us preferring red wine. So Francesco likes red wine, I like red wine. Well, there's a preference we share, right? But we share it in terms, this is a general state, that both our preferences are falling under the same concept. So it's the type that we share. It's not that Francesco's preference is mine. It's just qualitatively identical, but not numerically identical. It's not token sharing, and token sharing is the second state, where sharedness is a particular state, where the shared is one token rather than a type. And here we have to distinguish two cases. So I guess the word sharing, I haven't looked it up, I think it comes from Sharan, something like that, and the German word Schere is connected to sharing, and this is certainly one concept of sharing where we sort of, in sharing, we dissolve a unity. We cut it apart. We divide it up. This is distributive sharing. This is divisive unity dissolving, and the unity on the identity of the token. So we're talking about token sharing here, like a cake. You know, this is how we share a cake. We divide it up, and the unity is gone, right? The cake is off the table after we shared it. But there is another concept of sharing where sharing is collective or unifying. And of course in English we probably rather need, you know, terminology like jointness in this concept, but I guess it's also in sharing. And here the unity and identity of the token that's being shared is constituted, maintained, or strengthened in the process of sharing. So this is, you know, think of your early experiences with sharing an apartment. If it goes bad, you sort of just divide up the territories, right? This is your room, this is mine, this is my part of the kitchen, this is your part of the kitchen. You divide it up. If it goes well, if it's living well together, the unity of the apartment, you know, becomes constituted in the process of sharing. There's still going to be, you know, divided up rooms, but you know, there is the common element to which we both contribute, and that's constituted in the process of sharing. Now, as you can see from the emotional underpinning of how I present this, I think sytzen is collective token sharing. One life that's constituted by participation, by co-constitution of the unity. It's that sharing, it's not distributive type sharing, but collective token sharing. One life, many participants. Okay, and now let's look at a little bit at Aristotle. How so the first place to look in Aristotle for stuff like that is, of course, this concept of koinonia. And koinonia is a form of activity in Aristotle. It's a community or commonality. And Aristotle famously distinguishes at the beginning of his Politics between different forms of koinonia, and one is the one between husband and wife, and one is the one between master and slave. And he has a conception of the unity there, of koinonia, but it always puzzles me, and also the people who defend it puzzle me greatly. Because he says, and there are people who defend it, he says that wherever there is koinonia, there's got to be an arche, a dominating, there's got to be a principle, and one of the participants is the principle. So in master-slave relations, it's clearly the master who's the principle, and there is a sense in which the slave's action is the master's. The master owns the slave, and whatever the slave contributes to what's going on is really the master's activity in virtue of the master's being the principle of the action. And I guess I haven't read it up, but I guess something similar must be the case between genders. And I think this is ideological. I think there's no merit in it, because it's just a construction to displace the servant's or slave's activity. Of course, the slave is performing his or her own action. It's just an ideological construction that sort of subsumes the slave's activity under the master's, and I do not like it, and I think we cannot use it. But as Crisp pointed out in his objection against the collective reading, the place to look in Aristotle is a different one. And it takes us a little away from politics, but if we can find in friendship a better conception how activity can be shared in a token collective sense, we might be able to see it in other forms of koinonia. So that's it. What I want to have here is for it just to work in the case of friendship, and then we would have to discuss whether this can be expanded to other sorts of commonality. And here is what Aristotle says on friendship. This is book 7, the Nicomachean Ethics, and I haven't translated it, but I reconstructed the argument. So this is not a translation, this is a sort of a reconstruction, but it's close to the text. I think it's right. So virtuous activity is good in itself. But there is so what Aristotle is trying to do here is he wants to show why even virtuous people need friends. So friends are sort of, are they an external good? It's not quite clear. Let's keep this question in mind. Is this external or is it internal? But the claim is, well, you can be virtuous as you can. You're not going to be fully well unless you have friends. Why? And here is the argument. So, okay, you're virtuous. So this is good in itself. But you're lacking, if you don't have friends, you're lacking an additional pleasure. Pleasure is a good. And you're missing the sort of pleasure that comes from the contemplation of virtuous action. So it's not only in the doing that there is good, intrinsic good, but also in the contemplation of it. It's really nice, you know. David is such a virtuous person, and it's uplifting and pleasurable to see it. Now, but you know, not any contemplation is equally pleasurable. It is more pleasurable to contemplate one's own virtuous action. Now, on the other hand, it is not so easy to contemplate one's own virtuous action, because we can observe the activity of those close to us better than our own. And better observation gives more pleasure. So there is sort of, a tension now. It's more pleasurable if it's my own, but I cannot really see it that well. I can see other people's virtuous action better. I can observe it better, more objectively. I can see how well David's argument works, whereas in my case I'm sort of limited in my observational contemplative capacity because I'm in the process of doing it, right? I'm sort of more objective if David does it. But there is this tension now. Better observability is given in other people's virtuous action, more pleasure, and better observability leads to more pleasure, but it's better if it's my own. So why can't we have it both ways? And that's exactly the role of the friend. In the friend, you have it both ways. It is not you, it's alter, heteros, but it is your own. Very weird, right? So perfect well-being requires virtuous action which is our close ones, but not our own, as well as at the same time our own. And such is our friend's virtuous action. He, the friend, is the alter ego, heteros autos. And this is a phrase that made a big career in the history of philosophy. Especially in Cicero took it from Aristotle, and it has made a career, but it is obviously it is a weird notion, heteros autos. It is a straightforward paradox, and it's very easy to make fun of it. But it's sort of delusional. David is not I. So if I think he's I, I'm sort of I'm constructing something, I'm projecting myself. Or here, this alter ego, does it tell you to do things? It's delusional. It's sort of a bit of a sick idea, maybe. And it's very easy. This is only for the German-speaking among you. It's plenty of jokes about this idea of alter ego, and it is also in the literature. There's plenty of criticism. So here is Lorraine Smith Pangel in Aristotle and the Philosophy of Friendship. So she's an authority on the topic. And she says, Aristotle shows how the friend who is loved as another self is in some important way cherished as an extension of oneself. An extension that can tempt one, again, temptation, tempt one into the delusion that this other really is still oneself, and as such able to help overcome one's limitedness and mortality. It's basically a sick delusional projection of oneself into another person. So let me try to make sense of the paradox of the alter ego. Is there any way to make sense of the claim that you should see your friend's activity as your own, or is this just, sort of a delusional thing? How does and the way I want to approach this is via the following questions. How does our relation to our own activity differ from our relation to other people's activities, including our friends? And question, are there cases in which we relate to other people's activity in the same way as to our own? And here it goes. So here is a wonderful passage, and it is immediately following the passage on friendship, on the alter ego, but it's about half a page between it, but it is in the context. And I just wish Aristotle were more clear in this half page, but he isn't. Let me admit, this is now a reconstruction. You're not gonna find it just like that if you read the text. But here is something Aristotle mentions immediately following the passage on the alter ego, and it is in the context of his notion of the pleasure we are getting from contemplating. So what attitude is that contemplating? And he says, one who sees is conscious that he sees. One who hears is conscious that he hears. One who walks is conscious that he walks. And similarly, for all the other human activities, there is a faculty that is conscious of their existence. By the way, I inserted this conscious at places where I think it's the Rackham translation I'm using here. He omits the conscience, but he really should insert it because Aristotle repeats it all the time. And Aristotle doesn't have the concept of consciousness, right? Conscire, but maybe he has it, maybe. So the word here is aesthesis. And aesthesis is used in many ways in Aristotle. Right? It's not a well-defined technical notion, so we always have to work with it a little bit in Aristotle. But the term here he uses is aesthesis. And I guess that what he means here is, you know, this sort of first-personal self-awareness, self-consciousness that usually comes with attitude or activity. That at least under the right circumstances, it's not always the case. Aristotle is exaggerating here a little bit. It's not always the case. But it's sort of essential for our attitudes to be attitudes that under the right circumstances we can become aware of them. And this awareness has a special structure. It differs from awareness of anything else in that it is first personal self-awareness. It is pre-reflective. We are not making ourselves the content of the attitude. Rather, you know, the self is in the attitude itself. So it's still, you know, if you're consciously aware of something, you sort of know that you're aware of something without thinking about you. It's pre-reflective. So and there is plenty of terms in the philosophical literature, and I think it's all driving at the same thing. And I think it's right, and it's very deep, and in order to do sound philosophy, we need to engage with this tradition. So it is pre-reflective self-awareness or groundless self-knowledge, this Hans-Combian phrasing, or immediate self-consciousness, or first-personal knowledge, or DC, what have you, consciousness, awareness, thought, etc. That's all the same. That's this. So why does it come up in this context? In the context of the additional pleasure of contemplation of action. And I have a suggestion to make. Here is what I submit. What Aristotle should have said here. What Aristotle is very close to saying is that when we are friends, when we are living a friendship, we are aware of that friendship in a synesthetical way. So there is plural, pre-reflective self-awareness. That's what connects us. That's the feature and virtue of which we're living together. That consciousness of our activity. So plural pre-reflective self-awareness is synesthesis. This is a term Aristotle uses for the working together of different senses, as all of you probably know. So the haptic impression and the visual impression sort of work together in the, let's call it, constitution of the lectern. That's how Aristotle usually uses synesthesis, the working together of different senses, or koineaesthesis, but I submit that here is a form of consciousness which we have together. It's synesthesis in the social sense, not between different senses of the same person, but between different persons. And here is something I didn't do, but that would be very promising to do. Namely, you know, the term common sense, which definitely has acquired a social notion over the course of its development. Right? This is exactly where the history went. So Aristotle didn't fully go there, but the history took it there, developing from synesthesis the concept of common sense. Sensus communis in Aquinas. And of course, common sense then has been misunderstood as, you know, everybody's thinking the same. qualitative identity, but that's exactly not the point. It's not qualitative identity. It's not, you know, what everybody has in his or her own mind, but it's something like a being minded together in virtue of the consciousness of the activity. So that would shed a completely different light, very critical light on the history of the concept of the common sense. And of course, this syneistesis would be first personal knowledge of others, self-knowledge of other people. How? In that it is plural. It's ours. It's mine and yours in virtue of its being ours. So there is a sense in which I self-know you, insofar as we self-know ourselves. So that's the resolution of the paradox of the alter ego, and that's the conception of how our life, of how our token joint activity is unified collectively. It's in syneistesis, in this common sense, in this awareness of our doing it together. And the awareness is plural in nature, it's not singular. And here I say something critical about Hegel, I see. So yeah, let me read it. First personal knowledge has two numeri, singular and plural. It is a mistake to reduce first personal knowledge to the singular. First personal plural knowledge is neither a distribution of first personal singular knowledge, nor is first personal plural knowledge the self-knowledge of a collective singular. So this is a big mistake in the literature, and that sort of blocked the view of, you know, an adequate view of plurality, that we think, well, if it's one, it's got to be ones, in that it's got to be a singular, and that singular is collective. And that's a mistake. That's another way of trying to reduce it to a singular, not in a distributive, but in an overly collective way. You know, it's a collective singular. And it is especially tempting because in social life you actually do it sometimes whenever, you know, we create a fictional person, like a company or like a Leviathan, that is an additional agent. But normally, if we share a life, it's not that there is David, there is I, and there is the we that lives. It's not three lives. It's two lives together as one. So that's the metaphysics of it, and not three. But it's also not true that it's just two separate lives. It's two as one. That's the metaphysics, the right metaphysics of living together. Okay, so here there are two views. The singularist view, where well-being is a form of action. Each individual's behavior, if it is action, instantiates his or her own action and nobody else's. And each individual is only the subject of his or her own well-being. Whereas in the pluralist view, which is inclusive, which also allows for singular, you know, when I'm sitting on the toilet, we're not living together, you know. This is my life, you're out. Private life, what I do here instantiates really just my own. Of course, I'm influenced by cultural practices and so on, but this is just my own life. Privacy is very dear to me, and I do not want to deny it exists. And I like societies which give a great deal of room to private lives. I think it's wonderful. But there is also a plural life, a common life. And in this, well-being is also a form of action, but each individual's behavior, if it is action, instantiates his or her own action, and sometimes together with others' behavior, a collective's. And each individual is the subject of his or her own well-being, and sometimes a member of a plural subject of well-being. And if I recall correctly, this is it.